Hello, this is Jason from Liberate Raleigh, and this is another Liberate Raleigh video. Today's video, I'm going to, consider this a continuation of the Foundations of Anarchism series of videos that I did. I'm not going to put it in that playlist, but I think that this is sort of a counterpoint or complementary video to what was covered in that series of videos. In that series of videos, what I did was I gave definitions for various things relating to property rights, justice, anarchism, the state, and so on and so forth. And the purpose of that series of videos was simply to lay the foundational groundwork of what people mean when they refer to private property rights and capitalism, and exactly what those things are at a very basic definitional level. So that that series of videos covers what we're talking about when we refer to self-ownership, private property, property rights, capitalism, the free market, and so on and so forth. But you may watch those and think to yourself, well, this is all well and good, and maybe this is a nice economic, from an economic standpoint, these things make sense. But is there any moral reasoning behind why we should prefer those, that property rights setup versus some other property rights setup? And there is always some sort of property rights setup, even if somebody supposedly denies the existence of property rights. Let's say maybe a socialist does not, may argue against property or private property or something like that. But what they're really saying is they prefer that property rights be defined and enforced and implemented in a different manner than the libertarian private property capitalism that I covered in my series of videos. So everybody pretty much believes in some sort of property rights. They just disagree on what those rights should be and which rights, how these rights should be defined and enforced. So among all of these competing ideas, there is the libertarian private property, self-ownership, homesteading, free market capitalism definition of defining, way of defining and implementing and enforcing property rights. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the morality of these particular property rights, this particular way of defining and implementing property rights, and ask the question, is there any sort of moral reasoning behind why we should prefer these property rights, this property rights setup? And the answer to this is yes. So the way that, what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to talk about two books, one of which was written by a Marxist socialist named G.A. Cohen. And that book is called Why Not Socialism? Now, in this book, G.A. Cohen makes the case that socialism, communal ownership of property and objects, is morally preferable to capitalism, private property, and the like. And he makes this argument by saying that all of the reasons why one might prefer capitalism to socialism rest upon the idea that people are flawed from a moral perspective and do not empathize with their fellow man and do not typically, and these are general statements, obviously there's going to be exceptions to these comments, but generally speaking, people are not going to do things necessarily for the greater good alone. They're going to do things because they expect to gain something out of it. And Cohen makes the argument that because of this, the arguments for capitalism, based merely on the fact that people are flawed in this manner from a moral perspective, and capitalism is feasible in the real world because of these things, because it can provide incentive to people to engage in productive activity. And this is why socialism does not typically work in the real world. But Cohen says that under ideal circumstances, wherein people are morally perfect or nearly morally perfect, these things disappear. And in that case, what you would find is that people would prefer socialism to capitalism. And because all of the reasons for preferring capitalism to socialism disappear, socialism is actually morally preferable, because under ideal moral circumstances, it is superior. It is what people would choose voluntarily. They would much rather live in a society ordered on socialist principles. So Cohen wrote a short book, like I said, called Why Not Socialism, wherein he makes this argument. And what he does is he uses a picnic example, which I'm going to get into momentarily. But where I'm going with this is that Cohen wrote this book, I believe sometime during the 2000s, and if I'm not mistaken, it was released in 2009, maybe 2008, or thereabouts. And it was a short book. I think it was about 80 or 90 pages long. But this book did not go unanswered. A lot of people tried to make various arguments against it that ultimately reduced to feasibility problems relating to socialism, which simply go back to the point that in the real world, people are morally flawed, and therefore capitalism is preferable because it allows morally flawed people to engage in economically productive activity, and it allows the ability to order the social order society with these moral failings taken into account. So most of the arguments against it didn't seem to carry much force with them, because again, they ultimately reduced to simply restating what Cohen was arguing against. It was just, it did not really take into account Cohen's argument. However, there is at a minimum one exception which I'm aware of, and this is going to be sort of the guidelines for this video. And that person is Jason Brennan. And Jason Brennan wrote this book here, this right here. This is Why Not Capitalism. So I've read this book, and it's a very good book. I thought it was very interesting, and I thought that the moral reasoning in it was very good. I thought that the arguments were effective, and I thought that they were good. I thought that Brennan makes a good case for the moral superiority of capitalism as opposed to socialism, in addition to the practical and feasibility superiority of capitalism to socialism. So what I'm going to do is the book is divided into 4 chapters. Now this is 99 pages long, and I want to make 2 points before continuing. The first is I don't make claims to being any sort of moral philosopher. I don't have a PhD in philosophy. I'm not particularly knowledgeable about metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics from a philosophical standpoint, so I'm not going to claim that my comments in this video are somehow definitive and irrefutable, and that this definitively shows the proper property rights set up from a moral perspective. I don't know whether there's any argument that would completely 100% convincing to everybody. But what I think can be done, and what I think that Brennan does in his book, and what I will explain in this video, is make a reasonable argument for the morality of private property capitalism in such a manner that a reasonable person could listen to it or read it and say, yes, I think that this makes a good case. I think that this says that from a moral perspective, this is what should be done. And be able to compare these arguments to the arguments for socialism and say, you know what, my take from this is that I think that most likely capitalism does have the moral high ground. I think that that is a reasonable conclusion, but like I said, I cannot, from a strict philosophical, logical perspective, discuss the centuries and millennia of ethical philosophy and make a completely irrefutable argument. That is far beyond my capability. Maybe somebody like Jason Brennan could do that. I could not do that. I just want to speak to the average layperson and lay out something that would at least give them reason to think, yeah, okay, this is correct. So without further ado, and the second thing is, I'm not going to cover everything in this book, every minute detail. It's 99 pages long. I think it would take hours of video commentary to cover all of this and discuss it all. I'm going to do my best to keep this as brief as possible. So, with those two caveats in mind, I'm going to move on to the example that G.A. Cohen brings up in his book. And what he does is he uses the example of a picnic. Now, let's assume, for example, that everybody is morally perfect. Everybody is morally upright. Nobody wants to cheat anybody. Everybody's willing to do their fair share of work for the benefit of everybody else, and so on and so forth. There's no question of people being motivated in order to get the work that needs to be done for the benefit of everybody else. They don't need to know, well, what's in it for me? And people aren't going to try to cheat each other and aren't going to try to hurt each other and or steal from each other. None of that is going to take place. We're assuming an ideal moral scenario. So this is what Cohen does. And he says that if you assume that a group of people who were morally perfect went on a picnic, you would prefer that if you were one of the people in this picnic, you would prefer that everything be apportioned according to socialist property rights or socialism. And by that, he means you would prefer everybody go to engaging in the picnic would take all their property and put it into one common pool, and everybody would be able to access that pool and draw from it, and everybody would have fun. If somebody has a boat, if you go picnicking, or you go and there's a lake nearby and somebody has a boat, they throw that into the communal pool, and everybody's capable of accessing that boat. Because there are no moral failings among anybody, nobody's going to take advantage of that. You're not going to have, say, the tragedy of the commons or anything along those lines. And nobody's going to try to steal the boat. And so this would go for all the resources. If there's an orchard nearby, if there are apples, fruits in some manner, everybody would have free access to it. Any land that people hike on, everybody would be free to hike. And if there's any commodities or anything required to engage in any activity in the picnic, then everybody would be capable of accessing those resources. So all resources are communally accessible by everybody within that's on the picnic. And what Cohen says is, well, because if you assume that people are morally upright in this manner, obviously it makes sense that you would prefer to go on a picnic where this is the way to a picnic where everybody engages in communal property rights. And everybody would have a lot of fun. Everybody would be making sure that everybody had equal access to everything, and making sure that everybody was having fun and enjoying themselves. And because of this, the socialist property rights setup is preferable. And what he does, how he makes this argument, is he contrasts the socialist the socialist method of defining and implementing property rights to what would happen if, say, you used capitalist property rights. And he uses examples like, well, let's say one of the people on the picnic inherited an orchard, and they have private property rights in this orchard. So they can now exclude people from accessing this orchard, and maybe they start charging people for the apples, and maybe utilizing their access to these apples to take advantage of people, and force them to do things that they don't want to do, and so on and so forth. And maybe, let's say, somebody is really good at fishing, and instead of taking the fish that they catch and putting it in the communal pot, they take the fish and they withhold them unless they can get something from somebody else. So what Cohen does in his example is he points out that when you introduce the capitalist property rights scenario into this, you get people that try to take advantage of each other and use their exclusive ability to control various resources, which is the case under capitalism, to take advantage of other people, and this ruins the picnic. So, long story short, Cohen draws the conclusion that once you get past the whole idea that the only reason socialism doesn't work in the real world is because of people's moral failings, and you introduce morally perfect people into the scenario, you see that a socialist situation is preferable to a capitalist one. Now, this example is exactly what Brennan deals with in his book. And what he does is, first he parodies the example, then he explains what's wrong with the example, and then he uses these examples to come up with a positive argument for capitalist private property rights. So moving on, Brennan's parody is based on the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse Village. So what the Mickey Mouse, and I've never seen the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse Village. Apparently it's a TV show. I believe Brennan has kids, and he watches it, or has watched it with his kids at some point in the past. So the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse Village is it's a TV show, and there's various Disney characters that live there. I think Minnie Mouse lives there, Mickey Mouse lives there, and they own things. They have things. Off the top of my head, I think Minnie owns something called a boutique. I don't remember whether that's bow ties or something. Maybe somebody. I think somebody owns a farm, but pretty much everybody, all the characters that you know, Mickey, Minnie, Goofy, Donald Duck, have exclusive access to some piece of property or properties, and they don't have, there's no enforced equality. So some of them may have more resources than others, or access to some resources, more resources than others. So it's pretty much a idealized capitalist situation. And Brennan's scenario talks about how people in this Mickey Mouse Clubhouse Village engage in goodwill towards all. and everybody gets along just great. Nobody looks down on each other. Everybody's willing to help each other, even though they have exclusive rights in ownership to various pieces of property, and there's inequality amongst them. Some of them are richer than others, and despite all these things, they get along great. If there's a particular challenge that comes up out of nowhere, everybody's willing to pull their weight, and if necessary, contribute to the group, to some of their resources to overcome this challenge. And everybody just gets along wonderfully and is willing to pull their weight and do their fair share, and nobody tries to take advantage of anyone. And then Brennan says, now contrast this to, say, for example, if socialist property rights were instituted. Let's say Donald Duck decides, you know what, I want to nationalize the farming industry. And so he hires a bunch of goons to take over all the land and nationalize it for what he thinks is the betterment of mankind. And anybody who doesn't believe in this, he simply murders. So, and there's other examples he brings up where I don't remember all of them, but I mean, you can think of these things off the top of your head. Maybe somebody decides, well, you know what, we need to unionize and pool labor together. So if anybody doesn't want to pool labor together, we're gonna use force to make them, and if we need to, we'll kill them. Or maybe somebody decides that, again, they want to nationalize something or in some manner, and then they use the nationalized resources for their own benefit to line their pockets or to gain some sort of power over people. Now, Brennan uses this as a parody of Cohen's scenario. So if there are analogs to everything in Brennan's scenario, between Brennan's scenario and Cohen's scenario. Brennan takes an idealized capitalist society and contrasts it with a socialist society that takes advantage of people, hurts people, and because of this, therefore, the capitalist situation is the better way to go. But again, this is Brennan parodying Cohen's example. This doesn't actually necessarily disprove it, but he uses this as an example to show the flaws in Cohen's argument. So there are two main flaws in Cohen's argument that I'm going to go over, and this is, again, Brennan discusses this in the third chapter. The first two chapters relate to Brennan discussing Cohen's example and then his parody of Cohen's example, and then he talks about the flaws. And there are two main flaws, and I'm going to briefly discuss what those two flaws are in Cohen's argument. What Cohen does and what Brennan parodies is assuming an idealized scenario and then comparing it to a real world scenario. So what this means is that Cohen takes morally perfect people and places them within his socialist, within socialism, and then uses flaws present, moral flaws that are present in the real world that sometimes rear their ugly heads in a capitalist system, and says, and then compares the two, and no surprise, comes to the conclusion that, oh wow, see, socialism is better. Isn't it preferable to live in the socialist scenario as opposed to the capitalist scenario? Now, Brennan parodies this by creating an idealized, from a moral perspective, capitalist scenario, and utilizes real world human failings, which have been expressed within socialist societies in history and obviously can be, even from a theoretical standpoint, expressed even under a socialist property rights scenario, and draws the conclusion, see how much better capitalism is? It's when you have this idealized capitalist scenario and then compare it to a real world, a socialist scenario that suffers from real world failings, then obviously capitalism seems better. And the reason why this is not good is it's not comparing like to like. You're not making a fair and equitable comparison. You're comparing an apple, and this may sound cliche, but you are literally taking an apple and comparing it to an orange and saying, well, because this apple is not an orange and apples are better than oranges, then an apple is better than an orange. It's not a fair comparison. And there's another example to it which explains why, which Brennan brings up, which explains why the comparison is not fair. Let's say you were arguing with somebody and let's say you and somebody else were having a discussion over which was better. Which form of government was better, democracy or a monarchy? And let's say you said, you know what, I take the side of monarchy. I think that monarchy is a superior form of government than democracy. And somebody who disagreed with you and said, no, I think democracy is the better form of government. Explain to me why you think that democracy, a monarchy is better than democracy. And this person said, well, I mean, let's say you had a wonderful philosopher king that was a monarch and he ruled everything and he had the best interests of everybody at heart, and he used the resources of the state to implement policies that helped people improve their welfare and just did everything, and he was morally flawless and he never tried to take advantage of his power or use it to hurt anybody, and everything would just be great if we had this philosopher king. And in opposition to this, I mean, look at democracy. If you look at the democratic politicians, they take money from special interest groups. They're typically morally dubious. They lie all the time. When they run for office, they lie, they cheat. There's all these scandals. They use the power of taxation to steal from people. They then use this money to give to people that are special interests, and they utilize the apparatus of the state to engage in wars and kill people. And I mean, look how awful democracy is. I mean, just look at all these democratic governments and all these terror, and you could make a literal litany of all of the things that these democratic governments have done to supposedly prove your point that it's inferior to monarchy and the philosopher king monarch that you constructed. Well, obviously, you're not actually comparing democracy to monarchy. You're comparing an idealized philosopher king to democracy as it exists in the real world, which is, again, an unfair comparison. You cannot remove all of the moral failings of people as an assumption and then say, well, all right, well, this scenario ends up being better than what we see in the real world. It's not fair. So that's the first flaw that Cohen makes in his argument. And the second flaw is and it's sort of related to the first one, but this is a more explicit description. He defines socialism by the moral virtues which he wishes to show are examples of why it is superior to capitalism. And by this I mean he assumes that by definition socialism means goodwill and empathy for people and not taking advantage of people, and simply defines it in that manner, and defines capitalism by includes in the definition of capitalism moral failings and moral depravity. But again, you can't simply define the two property rights setups by include the moral virtues and failings within these property rights setups, because you're trying to make a moral arguments, and by assuming in the definition of what they are, the moral virtues and failings which you wish to use as evidence against or for socialism and against capitalism, all that you've done is beg the question. The argument is circular. If you're assuming the morality of the two property rights systems from the get-go, then the comparison is a moot point. You've simply assumed that which you are trying to prove. You want to prove that socialism is morally superior to capitalism, but you've defined socialism in a manner such that the moral virtues are present in socialism, moral depravity is present in capitalism, simply by their definitions. Now, that's not an argument, that's simply an assertion. In order to make an actual argument, you would need some sort of, you would need an explicit logical argument to show this, which Cohen does not provide, or you would need some sort of empirical argument. Now, Brennan in his book makes reference to some empirical evidence, which shows that people who are exposed to a property rights free market society and live within it are more likely to engage in morally upright behavior towards other people, even if they don't know those people. So, and I'm not, again, I don't want to cover every tiny detail in the book. I highly encourage you to read the book so that you can read all of the details. But the point is that Brennan does make reference to some empirical evidence which would show that, at a minimum, would make the idea that capitalism is synonymous with moral depravity, that the moral depravity that Cohen simply assumes it has, highly dubious. Which is pretty much the point. It's the point is simply to show that the assumption is flawed, and one of, again, the two flaws that Cohen makes when he talks about when he makes the comparison of socialism to capitalism. So here we see immediately that the comparison is invalid, and we have to move to the idea of making a like-to-like comparison of capitalism and socialism. Socialism, the communal ownership of resources, and again, capitalism, the private ownership of resources, which again is exemplified or described in my Foundations of Anarchism video, which I would encourage you to watch. So from here we have to move to morally idealistic socialism to morally idealistic capitalism and draw conclusions from there. So now that we've moved away from the apples to orange comparison of an idealized version of capitalism or socialism to a real world scenario of capital or socialism, we have to make an apples to apples comparison of idealized capitalism to idealized socialism and try to ask the question, well, is there any reason to prefer capitalism to socialism? Is there any advantage that one might have to private property rights under a morally ideal scenario where everybody has empathy for each other, there are no moral failings, nobody is trying to take advantage or steal from people, nobody wants to hurt anybody, everybody is willing to pitch in if there's a situation that arises, everybody's willing to contribute for the greater good if that is deemed necessary in a given situation. And that all of this is true for the people that reside in the socialist society as well as the capitalist society. And it turns out, and Brennan spends the last chapter of his book discussing this, there are reasons to prefer, even under the morally ideal scenario, private property rights to the capitalist private property rights to communal ownership under socialism. And one of the reasons is that the private property rights situation allows greater ability for people to engage in, say, long-term projects to implement what their version of the good life might be, which would clearly be different for everybody. But by having the ability to have exclusive ownership and control over various resources, that would allow somebody to implement whatever their version of the good life is, or engage in projects to somehow create a kind of ideal of something that is exclusively theirs and exclusively a product of their own mind and mental capacity. So taking, for example, farming. Let's say that you had an idea of what farming could be, and you wanted to create that idea and have it be an expression of what you think that farming could be. If you are unable to, if everything that you do is subject to communal oversight, then that is a hindrance upon how you can actually implement the ideal farming project that you have in store. So, and this goes along with another problem in that by having everything communally owned, that creates complications for who is able to use what and when vis-a-vis these long-term projects. So let's say you want to engage in farming and under a socialist property rights scenario, you would need to get permission from everybody involved in the society to implement your ideas, whereas under a capitalist system, you could, if it is possible for you to own various property and simply engage in whatever it is that your idea of the good life is. Now, this is also true even if you assume under a socialist scenario that, all right, well, let's say to facilitate and make things easier, there's certain schedules that everybody agrees to. Wherein they can access something. So let's say there's a laptop and you want to use this laptop to run the metrics for your farm, but you can only access that during between 8 to 9 p.m. at night or something. So obviously this creates a hindrance to your ability to engage in executing what your idea of the good life is. Now, there's other reasons why it might be preferable for somebody, even under morally ideal conditions, to prefer the capitalist scenario, and that reason is people become attached to various objects. Let's say that your mother gave you something and she's now dead. Let's say she gave you let's say you're a woman and your mother gave you her engagement ring, and it has extreme sentimental value. And because of this, you don't want to part with it. It's very important to you. And it's this specific object that carries emotional and mental value to you. Not being able to own it individually would appear to be the scenario under socialism. Now, they may make the case that, a socialist could make the case that, well, and try to draw a distinction between personal and private property, and personal property or possession is simply something that you have, like an object that you have, and this ring would fall under that scenario. And say private property would be something that you use for production. Well, one of the main problems there is there are things that are dual purpose, and pretty much anything and everything that you own could be used for profit or production. If you own a car, is it your personal property, Or if you use it to drive to work, is it a production good? And this, again, this is true for every piece of property. So the distinction doesn't seem to make much sense. And it doesn't really recover the socialist argument from the objection. If everything if everything is theoretically and potentially a production good, therefore everything is private property, therefore everything is everything is subject to communal ownership, and which would also be true for the engagement ring. If you simply like it and you want to keep it, well, okay, maybe it's your personal property, but let's say you decide that you want to sell it. So the same object is simultaneously something of high sentimental value and a means to engage in profit. Now, there's another thing to keep in mind while discussing all of this, all these ideas relating to projects, particularly long-term projects relating to somebody implementing the good life and their conception of the good life. And I think it's very important to keep in mind that the act of producing something, the act of production, organizing and planning production, is itself a creative endeavor. It takes a lot of thought, and it takes in some ways, yes, I would say artistic ability. To, let's say you have a farm and you want to, you have an idea for what farm agricultural production could be. It takes intelligence and the creative mindset to come up with a unique method for farming. And the reason why I bring this up and mention the point that production is a creative process, it's to, again, drive home the point that subjecting this to communal oversight or having it done by committee negates the unique ability of somebody to exercise their conception of the good life. And by doing so, I want to make reference to, and Brennan brings this up in his book, other creative endeavors. So let's say you're an author and you want to write a book. And let's say you want to be the only person that writes this book. Now, that's pretty much the case for most authors that actually exist. They may have an editor which edits the book, and maybe they get some, I'm sure they get some commentary from friends, but again, who they get this commentary from and under what conditions and whether it's implemented into the book is subject to their own judgment. Now, take the scenario of somebody having a farm which they produce food at, and they have a production process for creating and growing this food. It's essentially the same thing. You would not say, well, you know what, this author needs to have the writing of their book subject to communal oversight or communal activity because of socialist property rights. Everybody should be involved with every possible piece of property. Nobody would really make that case. They would simply allow this author to write the book the way that they see fit. And in the same manner, the production process is also a creative activity, and for the same reasons should be allowed to occur, and should be and again is facilitated and made easier by the existence of private property rights. So again, what we come to here is the conclusion that yes, there are reasons, and these are just some of them, and I'll get into some more, for why even under morally ideal scenarios, it would be preferable for us to have private property rights as opposed to the socialist communal society wherein everybody owns all the goods and all the resources. So we've already covered some reasons why, even under a morally ideal scenario, it is preferable to have a capitalist system of property rights as opposed to a socialist system of property rights. So continuing along these lines, there's the idea that a capitalist system is more productive from an economic standpoint than a socialist system. And typically most socialists don't really argue this point. Most people, and this is, again, this is a general comment, most people seem to agree that, yeah, capitalism is a better system, but it's immoral, and socialism is the morally ideal scenario. But most everybody that you would care to ask would say that, yes, capitalism is a more productive system from an economic standpoint. It creates more and varied goods at a cheaper price, which would mean it utilizes fewer resources to create all of these things and allows for technical innovation and at a higher rate than socialism does. But most people, for example, G.A. Cohen tries to make moral arguments against capitalism. However, the greater productive capacity of capitalism ties into the moral argument, because under ideal circumstances, capitalism would again be more productive than socialism. Now, what this does is this creates another reason for which people would prefer capitalism to socialism. And there's a very important moral reason why this is the case. Going back to the concept of the good life and people's ability to create the good life for themselves or to help other people create their own good life, which again, under morally ideal scenarios, there is empathy under both scenarios, both the capitalist and the socialist situation, for people to try to help each other and to help them attain the good life. Now, if there are more resources available and more goods, that creates an increased scope for positive freedom, in the sense that you can execute and engage in a greater variety of projects or activities in order to execute your version of the good life. So to use an example, let's say, and here we're going to compare the socialist to the capitalist system, wherein the capitalist system is more productive than the socialist system. So if we look at things, say under socialism, there's two different types of cars, and there's only 50 of each one. That's in a given year. And again, these are made up numbers. The numbers themselves in absolute terms don't matter. There's two different cars and 50 versions, 50 of each one have been produced. So that's the limit of that's the limit of the scope relating to automobiles and cars that people can engage in to create their version of the good life, or to help other people with their version of the good life. Now, let's say under capitalism, instead of two cars, there's 20 different types of cars, and there's 1,000 of each one. Well, that is a far greater scope to engage in pursuing your version of the good life with respect to yourself or others. So simply, it may seem mundane, but it's actually a very important moral case that can be made that greater productivity is morally preferable to less productivity, on the grounds that it allows for greater welfare, a greater scope of people being able to increase their welfare. And this is also true for the implementation of free markets, of market exchanges and voluntary exchange. So what these do, and again, this is a prominent feature of capitalism, is to have free markets wherein people take their property and exchange it for other types of property. And what this allows is it dramatically increases the scope by which people can pursue their version of the good life. It dramatically increases the scope which they can engage in to execute their projects or increase their welfare. If you have access to a market, that opens up far greater possibilities by which you can go into that market and alter your situation and your scenario in an advantageous way for implementing your version of the good life. If there's a market that for farming goods, for food, or like I said, cars, that market will allow you to exchange your current situation for what you think is a better situation, and also allow you to do that for other people, and give you a greater means and scope of ability for doing this. So here, markets are a positive good, even in the moral sense. So there's another problem with socialism, and that's relating to productive capacity, and that's the knowledge problem, which capitalism solves via free markets and so on and so forth, and private property. It's pretty impossible for, let's say there's a socialist society, and let's say that there's 10 people in it, and there's a certain pool of resources, and these 10 people want to decide, okay, how are we going to apportion and coordinate these resources in such a manner that it maximizes how we our welfare and creates the better good life for each of us. So if there's only 10 people and a limited amount of resources, it's possible that that group of people, because we're talking about such a small scale society, could maybe not reach what the optimal scenario is, but maybe they could get something close to it. They could get some gauge of what it might be to apportion out these resources for everyone to be better off. But the problem is, the more that you scale it up, the greater number of people you have involved, and the greater number of resources, the harder it gets to do this. Now, even in a small scale scenario, it's really impossible to definitively move towards what is the ideal situation. It's just that it makes it, because the scope involved is so much smaller, it just makes it more likely that the cooperative effort might get close to the mark. But as you scale up, it becomes less and less likely, to the point where it simply becomes impossible. When you're talking about 1 million people, and maybe you have a close cadre of 100 friends, and you're fully aware of what their desires are, well, once you try to coordinate how to apportion out to 1 million people when each person only maybe knows 100 of them, it's very difficult to do so. In fact, it's pretty much impossible. Now, this is solved in capitalism via market activity. People are able to go onto markets with their own property and engage in exchanges. And by having these markets available, the resources become moved from one area to another, from one person to another. And this is a method by which people, in a meta standpoint, coordinate the resources for the betterment of everybody as a whole. So the capitalist situation solves this knowledge problem, wherein this is and socialists have been discussing this for decades, but they haven't really, to my knowledge, come up with a really suitable solution to it that doesn't simply implicitly accept the existence of property rights. But the bottom line is, at a minimum, this is a very, very difficult problem that socialism has that capitalism solves right out the get-go, which alone would make capitalism, even under the morally ideal situation, the preferable property rights scenario. And there's another reason relating to productive capacity and productive ability that makes capitalism preferable to socialism is if there is a larger stock of goods, if there's more productive capacity, there's more and more varied goods and products and services available to people, that also creates a far greater scope for people to engage in nonprofit and charitable work under the capitalist scenario. If there's a million, and widgets are made up good, if there's 1 million widgets instead of 1,000 widgets, well, that's 990,000 extra widgets, which could potentially be used and pooled for nonprofit reasons and used for charitable purposes or something else. But they don't necessarily need to be used for profit oriented activities. There's no restriction or prohibition under capitalist property rights for people to engage in nonprofit endeavors as fully acceptable. People have the right to use their property in any manner they wish. If they wish to use some of their resources to engage in charity work or nonprofit work, again, perfectly acceptable. And given the greater productive capacity under capitalism, the potential scope for these nonprofit and charitable organizations and works is expanded dramatically. So again, here, even under the morally ideal scenario, we have further reasons why people would prefer socialism to capitalism. And again, under capitalism, we're talking about the morally ideal scenario. People would have empathy for each other, and they would want to help each other. So if they have a greater stock of goods, then again, under morally ideal situations, then these goods, there would be a greater stock for people to exercise this empathy and goodwill towards each other. And the scope for doing so is far greater. So again, simply more reasons why capitalism from a moral perspective is the preferable situation to the socialist socialist implementation of property rights. So continuing on with some more reasons why, even under a morally ideal scenario, people would reasonably choose a capitalist implementation of property rights versus a socialist implementation of property rights. Another reason would be through voluntary exchange, people would have validation of the fact that they have provided value for their fellow human beings. So I'll explain this a little bit more here. But let's say that you own a business, and this business produces recliners. And again, we're in the morally ideal scenario. So let's say that you have a business that produces recliners, and you're doing this for the purpose of helping your fellow man. You want everybody to have the best possible recliners that they could possibly own. You want them to be the most comfortable they could possibly be, to get the best rest in their recliners, to be most comfortable when they're watching television or reading books. So it is a moral imperative for you to create really awesome and wonderful recliners, and that these recliners fully satisfy everybody's preferences and everything that people want out of a recliner. You want them to get out of your recliners. So how would you know that this is done? Well, in the capitalist situation versus the socialist situation, you have free exchange as a validating system. You know that if somebody freely exchanges something for one of your recliners, you know for a fact that they value whatever they gave up to get your recliner. They prefer your recliner to whatever it is that they gave up. Sorry, I didn't explain that well. So because you know, given the fact that they have engaged in a free exchange, again, on the capitalist free market, you know that you have increased this person's welfare, that they've gotten a net positive benefit from the fact that they have access to your recliner and that they have been able to get this recliner. And you know that by engaging in this exchange for your recliner, that they're better off. So under the capitalist system, you have this objective way of knowing that that you've actually contributed to the betterment of mankind through your productive creativity, which again, I'm just using the word, the phrase that I used earlier. The creativity of your productive capacity is being utilized to help your fellow man. So again, you have this validation, it's an objective act that people engage in. It's not guesswork. It's very difficult to know and to get this validation under a socialist system. Maybe everyone decides that everybody's going to get your recliners, but you don't really know for sure whether they prefer your recliners or whether they're just going along with the consensus. But again, under the capitalist system, you have the validation of that free exchange that they have voluntarily engaged in to attain your recliner. And again, the markets also, let's say that you're engaging in productive capacity for the betterment of mankind and for moral endeavors. The profit and loss system is another guidepost for determining the best way to go about doing this, because people are exchanging and they exchange for various things. You know that if your business is turning a profit from a moral perspective, that you're providing value. So from a large scale perspective, if you look at the coordination of society as a whole and take into account this profit and loss system, you can see that the profit and loss system is a method by which welfare is increased by shifting resources from producers who are not who are engaging in less valuable endeavors to people that are engaging in more valuable endeavors. And you have that objective criteria of profit and losses, which gives you that data, it gives you that information that that can direct your actions such that you can help people better through this system. And again, from a meta perspective, looking at the society as a whole, that's the way in which resources are shifted amongst people from a moral perspective, a moral increase in welfare perspective, the betterment of your fellow man. This is how it's done in the capitalist system. This is the objective criteria. This is the objective validation of knowing that the system is working to move resources around to create the goods and services which increase the welfare of people. And if you're in the morally ideal scenario and your concern is the betterment of your fellow man, then having this profit and loss system, which is not available under socialism, is a benefit. This is a preferable system that gives you that data point that you simply don't have under socialism. And again, this is something that socialists have struggled with for decades, and at a minimum, this is a very difficult problem to overcome, and it's at least not quite certain whether it can even theoretically be overcome. And that goes back to and I've mentioned this in other videos, I haven't mentioned it in this one, the Mises economic calculation argument. I would say, I'm not going to get into that here, but I would say Google that and look into it. I've outlined it in other videos briefly, but that would be one thing to research as background information. But the bottom line is, typically speaking, socialist systems simply don't have this market data that capitalism does. So this is yet another example of why somebody might reasonably prefer the capitalist capitalist property rights to socialist property rights, even under morally ideal scenarios. So there's one last thing, one last reason, and I think that this is an extremely important reason for the moral preference of capitalist property rights versus socialist property rights. And the reason for that is, under socialist property rights systems, that's it. You have socialism. You have communal ownership of resources, however you want, depending on what socialists you talk to, how that's divided up. Maybe everything is communally owned, or maybe there's personal possessions that people may own individually, but the means of production are communally owned. But the bottom line is, under a socialist system, that's it. You live under socialist property rights. You live under those property rights, that property rights system. And you can't escape to a capitalist system. There is no way to do that. It's impossible. However, under a capitalist private property rights scenario, it is fully acceptable for people to pool their property communally and live however they wish. So under capitalist systems, you can create socialist societies within the capitalist society. People who say are socialists or communists, there is no restriction upon their ability to gather together, live together, or however they want to do it, but to coordinate their actions and their property for the express purpose of living within a socialist society amongst themselves. There's simply no restriction on that. The only thing is that, if somebody does not wish to engage in that society, they are free to engage in a capitalist society and live with property rights, private property rights. And this is true for any sort of property rights system that you may come up with. For example, if you're a Georgist, maybe Georgists will get together and pool their resources and have a quote-unquote, if this is fully voluntary, it wouldn't actually be a tax, but if everybody's voluntarily giving this up, but typically Georgists are promoters of a land tax. But let's say under a voluntary system, a free market capitalist system, there would not be taxes. So they would have maybe they would agree upon some sort of fee involved for use of land, and that's perfectly acceptable under the capitalist system of property rights. The converse is not true for any of these things. Now, having said that, I do want to clarify that that there do exist Georgists, communists, socialists, people of all different private property rights beliefs who don't have a problem with other people choosing to live under different property rights setups. So I'm fully aware of the fact that there are communists and socialists that are of the opinion that Yes, we think that the government apparatus should be destroyed, which again, if you're fully consistent with the private property capitalist setup of property rights, then yes, you also reject the existence of the government and the state. So there are definitely communists and socialists out there, because I run, not personally, but on the internet, I have encountered these people who say, okay, I prefer to live under a communist and socialist system. However, having said that, I would not prevent anybody from living under a capitalist system should they so choose. And again, this is, I've encountered also Georgists who also say, I fully believe that people should pay a land use fee, or however or single tax or whatever. However, they accept the logic of not having a government and not having a state, and they say, well, even though I would choose to live in a society that would have this, that would set this up via voluntary consent of those people involved, I would prefer to have this land fee. I fully understand that there are people that may disagree with me, and therefore I have no problem with other people, capitalists, for example, homesteading land, as long as they don't interfere with the Georgia society that I live in. So again, but in order, at an implicit level, at a foundational level, they are accepting the private property capitalist rights, the capitalist private property rights setup, but just choosing to exercise that freedom in a different manner, which is fine. I mean, this may seem like a semantic argument, and possibly it is, but I just, again, I find this, I think that this is an important point to make, that a fully committed socialist who does not accept any compromise with socialism, between socialism and capitalism, or socialism and any other property rights setup, does not have, a person would not have the freedom to live under that sort of a different sort of system under socialism. However, under a capitalist system, that simply is not the case. And I think that this is a very important moral argument, and I think it's a very good reason why people would choose the capitalist private property rights set up, even under a morally ideal scenario, as opposed to the socialist system. So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover here. I hope that this was, if you had never thought about the morality of capitalism, I hope that this came across as, you know what, you were listening to it and you thought, you know what, this makes a lot of sense. I see the morality of the private property rights system. I see that there is a good moral reason why we would prefer this sort of thing. That was pretty much my goal with this video. I hope that that was the case. Again, I don't claim to be, I don't have a PhD in philosophy, so I can't write a book based on philosophical logic, referencing the thousands of years of moral philosophy to justify these private property rights. It may be that you can't, it's a logically impossible endeavor to irrefutably prove any sort of particular property rights setup, as opposed to a different one amongst the different ones. None of them can irrefutably be defended. That's a possibility. I just hope that this video was enough to make you think, okay, I see where this, I see from a moral perspective where this comes from, and I agree. I think that this makes a lot of sense from a moral and ethical standpoint. That was my goal, and I hope that I accomplished it here. Again, this is the book, Jason Brennan, Why Not Capitalism. Very good book. I highly recommend you get this. Like I said, it's not very long. It's 99 pages. I covered a lot of the big topics, but there's some detailed material in this book that I think you should read. And I learn better when I read things. So again, go out, buy the book, and get it on Amazon.com. Read it, learn from it. And that's pretty much it. I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.